Hello and good evening to the Teagasc Virtual Beef Conference. You're all very welcome. My name is Aidan Murray and I'll be your host for this evening. I'm one of the Teagasc Beef Specialists. This meeting tonight is the first of a two-night series, the second night being on Wednesday night, and I'll give you more detail on that as we progress through the evening. Tonight, I'm joined by two speakers. The first is our new director in Teagasc, Professor Frank O'Mara, and our second speaker will be Chris Daly from ICBF, whom I'm sure is well known to a lot of you out there. The format for this evening's conference is that Frank will present first a paper, we'll take a few questions, and then we'll move to Chris, take a few questions after Chris's talk, and we'll open it up then for a general discussion. And if you want to ask a question or take part, you know, it's important to use the Q&A function, type in your question, and we'll get it, and hopefully we'll ask the panelists as it comes through. The plan is that we'll run for an hour, so we hope to finish up pretty promptly at around 9 o'clock. So without wasting any time, we'll move to our first speaker. Director, you're more than welcome. I'm delighted to see you on. The director is going to run through looking at our climate change targets and give us some of the key areas that we can go towards achieving and meeting those targets between now and 2030 in particular. So Frank, I'll hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Aidan, and I just bring up the slides here, and can you see those, Aidan?
Yeah, they're up, Frank, yeah.
Okay. So look, good evening, everybody. And look, very strange circumstances here for a conference like this. And look, we're very disappointed, I suppose, that we weren't able to have a face-to-face event. We were looking forward to being in Claremorris tonight and hopefully having, you know, a couple of hundred people in the room there with us. But obviously, we have to put safety first and abide by the regulations around meetings and so on. So we decided to take this event virtual. But anyway, look, I hope between tonight and Wednesday night you'll be able to tune in and stay with us and hopefully get a good information session, a good briefing, and a chance to have some questions with us. So look, as Aidan said, I'm going to talk about the climate obligations. But before I do that, maybe just to talk a little bit about this, about the commitment of Teagasc to beef farmers. And look, this is my first National Beef Conference as Teagasc Director. And I suppose for me, you know, the beef industry is a very important industry. There's over 70,000 farmers involved in beef production. There's a further 10,000 people working in the beef processing industry. And there's exports of over 2 billion worth of beef last year. And that 2 billion ends up being spent then in every parish in the country. So the beef industry is a really important part of agriculture, and it's a really important industry for rural Ireland. And, you know, our job in Teagasc is to support beef farmers in terms of their aspirations and their hopes for their farms and what they can do. And in Teagasc, we have about 23 dry stock clients, and, you know, 2/3 of those approximately have suckler cows. So you can see that for us, in terms of our clients, the beef industry, and in particular the suckler industry, is a very, very important part of that. Obviously, we try to support all beef farmers, not just those that are our Teagasc clients, through the information that we put out and through the events that we organise that are open to everybody. We have about 200 beef discussion groups at the moment, and there's about 3,000 members in those. We'd actually like to see that growing, because we feel discussion groups are a great way for farmers to learn about technology and to learn about what's going on other farms. So we will be working in the next year to try to increase that number up from the 3,000. In terms of the resources that we have available or that we make available for the beef sector, we have almost 140 advisors, you know, dealing with those 29,000 clients. And in a support role for those, then we have 11 specialists, of which Aidan is one of those specialists and program advisors. Look, we have a lot of initiatives going on for the beef sector. I'm not going to describe them all tonight, but just to mention that we have two new advisory programs starting. One for sucklers called Future Beef, and one for dairy beef called Dairy Beef 500. And the essence of those really is that we're using demonstration farms to show best practice and to work with the farmers involved in terms of implementing the technologies that we think are important, and then using those farms as exemplar farms and farms that we'd use for open days or farm walks or discussion group visits or whatever. So they're two very important programs for us, and both of those are part of what we call the wider signpost program. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then on the research side, we have a very active research program in Grange, and over the course of the last 12 months, we have invested in new facilities at Grange, and we have an ongoing program of investment there. And we've also invested in some new researchers and support staff. This is actually a picture from earlier on today. We were delighted to be up on the farm of Oliver and Christine O'Hara in Lecaun in Leitrim for the launch of the Future Beef program, and the minister was there, and he gave I suppose great encouragement to us in relation to kicking off this new program, and we're very thankful to Oliver for his both his participation in the program, but also for his hosting us there today. And look, this program, as I said, it involves demonstration farms. In this, there's 24 farms around the country, almost one in every county, on which we'll be working with those farms. Oliver is one of those. There's another 23, and we'll be implementing Oliver and his colleagues will be implementing technologies with our support that, number one, I suppose, will contribute to a better livelihood for Oliver and other farmers, and number two, will help in terms of the environmental sustainability of his farm. And for me, this program, it's all actually in the name, Future Beef. We're talking here about the future of the industry, and I very firmly believe that there is a very strong future for the beef industry in Ireland, in both the suckler industry and the dairy beef industry, and that future is there for us. And Teagasc will have a role, hopefully, in helping farmers realise that future. But we also have to work about creating the future. And one of the challenges for the future is the whole area of environmental sustainability and climate change in particular, and what society and customers for our products want in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions. So for the future and for the sustainable future of the beef industry, we're going to need to address challenges like that, as well as the normal challenges around technical efficiency and so on. So look, what I'm going to talk about tonight really is that whole issue of greenhouse gas targets. And for the last month or 6 weeks, we've heard an awful lot about those. And I suppose this started really with the national legislation, the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Bill, in which, as a country, we committed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, by 51% by 2030. And that's written into legislation now. So that's a very, very firm commitment made by the government. At the same time, like, Ireland is not alone, I suppose, in terms of making commitments like that. The EU, in its program called the Fit for 55, that's targeting a 55% reduction in emissions by 2030. And I suppose, while we can maybe look at this all the time as well, we have to meet these targets, and we've all this agenda coming down on top of us from government or so on. But we also have to remember, I suppose, that the people that buy our product, the markets and the rest of society, they view climate change as a very, very important issue. And it's central, I suppose, to what we call our license to farm. And it's central to the selling of our products in international markets. So it's really important, I suppose, that we're addressing this issue and seen to be addressing it in an appropriate way. In terms of the whole play out of this in the national media for the last month or so, one of the big issues that got a lot of attention was the setting of these, what are called sectoral targets. And these were set out in what's called the Climate Action Plan 2021. And in that, as I said on the last slide, the overall target for the country is to reduce emissions by 51% by 2030. And then the national emissions were broken down into these 6 different sectors. And the one that I'm going to talk most about tonight, obviously, is agriculture. And in comparison, I suppose, to other sectors, agriculture has got the smallest target. Its target is to reduce emissions by somewhere between 22 and 30%. And maybe just to contrast that with electricity, that has to reduce emissions by up to 80%. So look, none of these targets are easy, and the target for agriculture is certainly not easy. And I suppose we have to recognise that it's in the context of this very large ambition for the country. Just look, I'm conscious I don't want to throw too many figures out tonight, but just like, what does this 22 to 30% reduction mean? Well, in 2018, agricultural emissions were, when expressed as carbon dioxide equivalents, were 23 million tonnes. That's the amount of emissions that came from agriculture. And with this target, we have to reduce that to between 16 and 18 million tonnes. So that's a reduction of 5 to 7 million tonnes of CO2 from agriculture by 2030. And just to look at how agricultural emissions have been going for the last couple of decades, and this charts them back to 1990. And look, they've been fairly stable with some ups and downs over that period, but fairly stable around the figure of 20 million tonnes or so. In the last decade, they have risen. They were at their lowest probably back here around 2009, and they have risen over the last decade and up and down a little bit the last two or 3 years. But I suppose, that maybe just shows the scale of the challenge, that we have to try to take 5 to 7 million tonnes off those emissions and get them down to between 16 and 18 million tonnes. In terms of where do agricultural emissions come from? Like most of you, I'm sure you're running farms and you're wondering where on your farm are all these emissions that we're talking about. Well, most of the emissions on a farm, on a livestock farm, come from the cattle or cows or sheep producing methane. And they do that as part of their normal digestion process when they're digesting feed, forage feed in particular. The other big source of emissions on a farm, on a livestock farm, is fertilizer use. And that releases a gas, another greenhouse gas called nitrous oxide. And the third big source of emissions on a farm is the slurry or farmyard manure that's produced, or indeed the animals defecating and urinating at pasture. That manure produces both methane and nitrous oxide. So they're the main sources of emissions that you will have on a livestock farm. So I suppose the big question that has been debated at length over the last number of weeks is, how can we meet these targets? And you'll have heard a lot of people and a lot of commentators focusing in on the size of the national herd, and that's very much because on a livestock farm, a lot of the emissions come from the livestock. So people are saying, well, sure, look, the only way we can reduce emissions is to reduce the number of livestock on the farm. I suppose our proposition and our proposal is that there is another way to meet those targets, and that is through the application of new technologies and indeed some old technologies, and by improving efficiency on farm. And that's the pathway that we're going to work with farmers in terms of working towards those emissions targets. So the two big things, I suppose they're messages that Teagasc has been talking about for years and years, is to, get the efficiency right on your farm, and where there are appropriate or good technologies to apply those technologies on your farm. And some of you may have heard of what's called the Teagasc MAC curve. MAC means marginal abatement cost curve. And really all that is, it's a collection in a kind of a graphical form of all the technologies or efficiencies that can contribute to reducing emissions. I'm not going to say any more about it than that, but I suppose we have for a number of years now been trying to identify the technologies that can reduce emissions, and also where we can usefully get more efficiency from the system to reduce emissions. And I'll talk a bit about that more in the next couple of slides. I suppose in terms of the previous slide where I showed where the emissions come from on a livestock farm, the main one actually is methane from the livestock. We don't really have too many handles to pull to reduce methane emissions at the moment. That's hopefully going to change. So a lot of the focus up to now, and indeed for the next couple of years, is going to be focusing on nitrogen and trying to reduce the amount of emissions that come from fertilizer and manure nitrogen. We're very conscious that livestock production, in particular cattle production, is not a high margin business. So if these technologies don't contribute to the bottom line of farmers, well, then it's going to be obviously hard to persuade a farmer to adopt them. So we're very conscious that some of these may require some level of incentive to meet the costs if there is going to be a cost increasing effect. And the other point we'd say is that industry does need to work together in terms of trying to get a whole of industry response to reducing these emissions. So just briefly then to set out this pathway through technology and efficiency that we see to reducing our emissions. And bear in mind, we're starting off here with the base year being 2018 and Irish agriculture producing 23 million tonnes of carbon dioxide. And at the end of the road, or at least at the 2030 milestone on the road, we have to target having those emissions down to between 16 and 18 million tonnes of CO2. So the first step on the road is implementing the technologies that we have already identified in this famous MAC curve. And I'll talk a bit about those in a second, but they're not things that will be strange to you. They're things like better breeding of livestock, better grassland management, getting your soil fertility right, and reducing the amount of fertilizer that you're using because of having better soil fertility or because you're using clover. There's a new type of fertilizer that we're proposing called protected urea that has lower emissions than calcium ammonium nitrate. So anyway, there's all that basket of technologies that have already been identified in the MAC curve. And by you farmers implementing those on your farms, we can take about 2 million tonnes off the national agricultural emissions. Now that's obviously very important, but it's not going to get us to this 5 to 7 million tonnes. So we're obviously working on other technologies that could reduce emissions. And again, some of those are around fertilizer and the type of fertilizer that might be used. We also have some very encouraging research around feed additives that will reduce methane. And another strategy that has been proposed is to slaughter our beef cattle earlier. The agenda here, or the proposition here, is that you can get an animal to his or her slaughter weight, a couple of months younger. Well, they're around then on this earth, breathing out methane for a couple of months less, and therefore over their lifetime they produce less methane. So with all those type of technologies that are at a fairly advanced stage of research or are ready to apply now, as in the case of earlier slaughter, we could take between another 1 and 2 million tonnes off that national emissions. That will still leave us short. So to make up the last step of the road, well, we're going to need to do a lot of further research on technologies that I suppose we're only at the very early stages of researching now. And that's the use of things like these feed additives for grazing animals, and figuring out a way to get them into the diet of grazing animals. And also we have some very encouraging research around the breeding of low emitting animals. And we would hope then that through intensive research into those areas, we'd be able to get another 1.5 to 3 million tonnes of emissions. And that will bring us to the target of 16 to 18 million tonnes and put agriculture on the road to being climate neutral by 2050. So there is a pathway there to reach the national targets without having to cut the national herd. It's not a very straightforward pathway. It's a narrow, twisty pathway. There's lots of, we can't see around some of the corners in it, but it is there. And that's the pathway that we're advocating that the industry should follow in order to reach these targets. In terms of how we'll work with farmers to achieve these targets, because we're very conscious it's you farmers that actually are going to take the actions that will make all this possible. Well, we have initiated what we call the Signpost Programme as a national programme supporting farmers for climate action. And in that programme, we have over 100 of these demonstration farms. There's both suckler and dairy beef farms in that. As I mentioned, we already today launched the Future Beef Programme with 24 suckler farmers in that. We'll shortly be launching the dairy beef programme, and I think there's somewhere around 14 or 16 dairy beef farmers will be in that programme. And they are the main programs we're going to use then and use those farms for walks, events, discussion groups, and obviously a lot of dissemination through media. We'll also be providing training to farmers, and we'll be working with farmers who want to create a plan for their farm that takes in all the aspects of sustainability. That's both economic, environmental, and social sustainability. So for now, the technologies that we'll be focusing on very much are what I said: breeding, grassland management, animal health, saving nitrogen fertilizer through the use of low emission slurry spreading or clover or better soil fertility, or for the remainder of the nitrogen fertilizer you use, to use as much of that as protected urea as possible, and trying to get your animals to their target carcass weight as early as possible in their life. And actually, we will have a presentation on that topic of earlier slaughter on our Wednesday evening session from Paul Crossan. Look, I'm not going to go through this slide in total, but it just gives you a flavour maybe of all the various KPIs or key performance indicators that we'll be working with Oliver O'Hara and the other signpost farmers in terms of achieving on their farms. Just this again is I suppose focusing in on what those technologies are. I won't go back over them again, but they're the type of technologies that will improve the greenhouse gas emissions on the farm. And as I mentioned earlier, we still we have a lot of research that's needed over the coming years if we are going to be able to achieve these targets through technology and efficiency. But we have some very promising research. You may have heard on radio last week talk about some of the research we've done on reducing methane emissions of beef cattle through breeding. So some very exciting work there. And in terms of feed additives, there's a lot of talk of feed additives, and you hear things like seaweed being mentioned and so on. There is actually one quite promising additive that is currently being assessed by the European Food Safety Authority in order to see are they going to license it for use in the EU, and we think that could be a potentially very important additive to help us reduce these difficult to reduce methane emissions. So to summarize then, in terms of what we are going to do over the coming years in relation to the climate targets and in relation to supporting agriculture, well, obviously, we won't take our eye off the ball of supporting you farmers in terms of your living standards and well-being, because that's why you're in the business. You're farming because you want to make a living out of it, or you're part-time farming because you want it to contribute to your family's living. And look, we recognize that's your priority. We will be promoting, as I said, this pathway through technology and efficiency. It is going to be a priority for our advisory service. This signpost program that we have launched, which has support from all the processing industry, I should have said, both the dairy co-ops and the meat processors. Over the 5 years, between the industry contribution and the state contribution, as through Teagasc, we'll be spending up to 17 million on that program. So it is a very significant investment in working with farmers to reduce emissions. We'll obviously be accelerating our research into new technologies. As part of the process, we will be reviewing how the national inventory both calculates emissions and calculates sequestration on your farm. And we'll also be ensuring that any new technologies that we developed can get counted in the inventory, because there's no point in you farmers doing something to reduce emissions if it doesn't end up getting counted when we calculate the emissions for the country. We'll also be supporting diversification opportunities such as organics. And I suppose overall, we would like to develop with others, obviously, a pathway for the industry to 2030 and beyond that, so that we can, I suppose, be demonstrable good performers in relation to climate to our customers and to the rest of our citizens here in Ireland and beyond. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions later on, but for now, I'll hand back to you, Aidan.
Okay, thanks, Frank, for a comprehensive presentation and a couple of very interesting points raised there. Just in one of the questions that came in, Frank, and I had it in my notes to ask you, was that it's very obvious from some of the criteria that you laid out there that different farms can contribute in different ways. We've got a huge diversity there in terms of intensive farms versus the more extensive farms. And the question that has come in is, should each farm be assessed individually and those with the highest emissions reduced towards a national average? It's obvious probably that there'll have to be individual planning needed so that everybody contributes.
Look, yes, I think, look, we're going to need every farm in the country really to embrace some of these technologies if we're going to reach the targets. At the moment, we don't have, we just have a sectoral target for the whole of agriculture. So that has not been broken down and distributed out to individual farmers. And look, to the best of my knowledge, there's no plans to do that. So it's a case of collective action. And I suppose, that's one of the things we would be saying to other sectors, that look, agriculture, it is a difficult sector to work with, because as you said, there's no one size fits all here. It's not like, electricity generation, where we know we need to put in more windmills, both onshore and offshore and so on. It's fairly straightforward what we need to do. The challenge there is obviously, the investment and the planning and so on. But in agriculture, you have over 100,000 farms in the country, and they each have a different story to tell and a different way to address emissions. So look, that's why I think it's really important that, Teagasc as a state agency, industry and farmers all work together to see, I suppose, through awareness building and through demonstration, that we can show to every farmer what he or she can do, and hopefully encourage them that, for the greater good of the industry, that it is important that they address on their farms what they can do in relation to emissions. And I suppose, the incentive really is, a lot of the technologies we're talking about, they actually help save money on farms. If we can reduce nitrogen, for instance, and that's a big focus of what we're talking about now through low emission slurry spreading, soil fertility, clover and so on. So if we can help farmers to reduce nitrogen, look at the cost saving that's going to leave on farms next year with the price of nitrogen.
Yeah, I suppose one of the worrying things is that one of the technologies on the MAC curve is the use of this protected urea. And, on one hand, we're trying to promote it. On the other hand, farmers may have difficulty in sourcing it maybe next year, which is a challenge in itself.
Absolutely. And look, protected urea, it's somewhere around 10% of straight nitrogen sales this year. The target is by 2030, we'd have that up to 65% or even more of straight nitrogen sales. So look, we do need to see progress every year in that. I suppose equally important though, Aidan, is if we can find ways to support farmers, or farmers can find ways to reduce overall nitrogen usage, like that's the real win-win in terms of saving money and also saving emissions. And then we're saying that for whatever fertilizer you do have to continue to use, well, look, consider protected urea and that. So look, it's not going to suit every situation. We recognize that, but where there is that possibility, it's actually cheaper. Urea is a cheaper source of nitrogen than straight calcium ammonium nitrate, nitrogen. So again, there's savings there for farmers.
Absolutely. Frank, I'll leave it there with questions. There's questions coming in, but maybe we'll save some of them towards the end. And thanks for your contribution so far. I'll maybe move on now, and we'll move to our second speaker, who is Chris Daly from ICBF. Chris is coming on to speak about the commercial beef value, which is a new concept to many commercial, or will be a new concept to many commercial beef farmers, whereby we're trying to put a value on prime cattle as such, whether it's coming from the suckler herd, whether it's coming from dairy beef crosses or pure dairy crosses, in terms of, what is the genetic potential of these animals, looking at particularly the terminal traits and what these animals can potentially deliver. So if Chris is there, I'll maybe ask him to come on and hand over to Chris.
Yeah, thanks Aidan.
Chris. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it's perfect. I'll just share my screen there. So can you see that?
Yeah, that's fine, Chris.
Okay, that's great. So good evening, everyone. As Aidan just mentioned there, I'm going to talk to you about the new tool or selection tool for non-breeding beef farmers, so your dry stock trading farmers, called the commercial beef value, or to give it a short term, CBV. So this graph just gives a breakdown of the livestock farms in Ireland. So obviously over here on the right hand side, I'll just change that to a laser pointer, make it easier to see. You have your suckler herds, dairy herds, small suckler herds. But these three herds here is what I draw your attention to. And there's about 23,000 herds in that grouping there. And these are herds that are beef herds, but they're not breeding. So they're buying in all of the animals and either taking them through to slaughter themselves or selling them on live for other people to take through to slaughter. And realistically, you know, the industry and the ICBF Herd Plus service as well has been very much geared towards breeding herds, you know, your dairy herds and your suckler herds. But there hasn't been a whole lot there to offer for the non-breeding beef herds. So what this CBV will do is it'll assist them when selecting beef animals to take through the slaughter or to graze and maybe sell on again as stores. So this is a problem that a lot of trading farmers, particularly on the dairy beef side, farmers buying dairy beef calves every year, it's a problem that they're faced with. You have a pin of dairy beef calves here, a mix of Limousin, Angus and Hereford from their appearance. But you can't really tell anything else from those calves apart from their breed makeup and the fact that, look, they're all in a healthy, well-fed state. But as regards their genetic makeup and their potential to perform after being purchased, you know, the farmer can't really tell that from looking at the animals, particularly when they're only 3 or 4 weeks old, which is when the vast majority of these calves are sold. So look, just to give an example, this calf, I have 0% Jersey and my daddy is a high carcass merit Hereford bull. And this one, on the other hand, is quarter Jersey. So its dam is a crossbred dairy cow. She's half Jersey. So the calf is 25% Jersey and the daddy is a high carcass merit AA bull. But of course, you know, the farmer can't see that from looking at the animals in the pen in the mart. So there is a real need there for farmers to be able to see this information, both in marts, but also if buying privately from farm to farm, to have that extra bit of information. And what if we could give that extra bit of information to these farmers, even if it's something as simple as a euro monetary value on the calves, so similar to an EBI or a replacement or terminal index that we have on the dairy and the beef sides respectively, and a star rating as well with it, just to help them rank the animals. So the euro value on its own mightn't tell them a whole lot, but with the star rating, it can tell them where it ranks. So, you know, you have your 1-star animal versus your 5-star. Those two calves, you know, they could be the same breed, they could be even from the same farm, but with very, very different genetic makeups. So what exactly is the commercial beef value? So it's essentially the Eurostar terminal index, but with the calving traits removed. Because if you think of a farmer, a dry stock farmer buying maybe dairy beef calves or stores or suckler weanlings or suckler stores, the calving traits don't really matter to them. You know, it doesn't really matter if that animal went through a difficult calving or if it was long gestation. Yes, that's important to the breeding farmer, to the dairy farmer or suckler farmer, but not to the person purchasing them. So the traits included are the ones that are of economic importance to the farmer from the point of purchase forward. So you have your feed intake, docility, and the 3 carcass traits, which are carcass weight, conformation, and carcass fat. So how will it be displayed? So this is just a screenshot of the commercial beef value profile that farmers can access through the Herd Plus service. So this is an example of a suckler herd. It's suckler animals. So down the left-hand side here, this column, it gives you the breed type. So these are all sucklers, the euro value, the crossbreed star rating, and the within breed type star rating. Now, this is a slight change from what a lot of suckler farmers would be used to in within breed stars, in that it's not specific to a particular breed like Angus or Hereford. It's specific to the animal type. So there's 3 types. You have suckler, which is your beef sire and beef dam, your dairy beef, which is your dairy dam and beef sire, and then your dairy, which is your dairy dam and dairy sire. So it's within, the animals are ranked within the breed type. So this star rating here within breed type is these animals being ranked only against other suckler bred animals. And then you have the figures for the 5 traits that are included in the index. So the weight, conformation, fat, feed intake, and docility. Any traits where the figure is going the wrong direction or it's the wrong side of 0 is highlighted in red. So if you look here on feed intake, there's 2 animals highlighted in red. Now feed intake is one where you actually want the negative figure because you want the animals to eat less feed. So there's 2 animals here that have a positive figure and they're just highlighted in red. So to give an example of dairy beef, so you can see here, it shows the breed type. These are dairy beef animals. The index values are much lower than the suckler ones, as you would expect. You have the across breed star ranking and the within breed type and the figures. And again, you can see a lot more figures are in red here. So on carcass fat and feed intake, a lot of the animals are going the wrong direction. So they're the wrong side of 0 here. And then this is an example of a herd where they're all dairy cross dairy. So these are actually all Frisian males. And as you can see, the carcass traits here are really starting to go the wrong way, as you would expect, you know, where you have animals where their genetics are completely dairy derived. Now, this is actually a very interesting herd as well, because these are all Frisian bull calves. This is actually a pedigree Holstein Frisian herd, so there's no crossbreeding going on here. And these are all Frisian AI sired calves. So there's no Jersey genetics or crossbred genetics there that's having a negative impact on any of the carcass traits. But look at the range in the commercial beef value from the best animal in that herd to the worst. And these are all Holstein Frisian calves, all black and whites. And if these were going through the mart, all of these calves on the same day, the farmer would have no idea that this calf up here is 113 euros higher a commercial beef value than the calf at the bottom. And when you look at the other traits over here, you can see like there's 16 kilos in their carcass weight. And this is where the within breed type star rating really comes into its own. If we only focus on a crossbreed, the majority of the dairy cross dairy animals will be 1 and 2 stars. We know that because they're going to be far inferior to the dairy beef and much further inferior to the suckler animals. But the within breed type, this is critical for farmers who are very much aligned to a specific system and a specific enterprise. So a farmer could see that, look, this calf here is 5 stars within that dairy cross dairy cohort of animals, and the animal at the bottom is 1 star. So it really allowed them to differentiate between the best and worst animals that are applicable to their own enterprises. So what animals will receive the CBV? So all suckler animals, all your commercial suckler males and any uncalved females. So, you know, your suckler weanlings, both bulls and heifers, store bullocks, store heifers going through the mart, all commercial males, except, you know, once a suckler female calves down, then she no longer receives the commercial beef value, because the decision has been taken then to use her for breeding. So she's no longer a prime animal. All dairy males will receive it. So all of your Frisian bull calves or your Frisian cross Jersey male calves will get it. And all dairy beef males and uncalved females. So similar to on the suckler side, once a dairy beef female calves down, she's probably been bought into a suckler herd as a replacement, and the decision has been made to retain her as a replacement, so she no longer gets the CBV. So these animals will not qualify. So all pedigree beef males and females won't be eligible for it, because they're specifically for breeding, and the CBV is not a breeding index. Dairy females, so dairy cows and dairy replacements, won't get it, and any calved female. So any female, whether she's beef or dairy, once she has a calf, she no longer gets it, because she's no longer a prime animal. So in short, it's all of your prime cattle, you know, what we would consider prime cattle going through the processing plants, will receive or will be eligible to receive the commercial beef value. So where will it be visible? So herds that are subscribed to the Herd Plus service can see it online, you know, similar to looking at a Eurostar profile or an expected calving profile. You log into your Herd Plus account, you go to view profiles, and you see commercial beef value, and it'll open up the profile, and you can sort and you can filter all of these columns, you know, highest to lowest or whatever the case may be. There's also a plan to roll this out to mart boards. So a lot of you will be familiar with both EBIs and Eurostar index details being on mart boards now with the last number of years since BDGP started in 2015. I think it was maybe 2016 that these screens were introduced to marts that gave this extra genetic information. So we'll be able to roll the CBV out onto the mart boards as well. And we will be looking to develop a report as well, like a PDF report that can be printed off that will be available to beef herds as well that are subscribed to the Herd Plus service. So just some validation work, and this is some work that my colleague Andrew Cromie and I think Ross Evans was involved in this work as well. So what they did was they looked at animals that were slaughtered in November 2021, and they focused their analysis on steers. So there was 40,000 steers in total across the suckler, dairy beef and dairy that were slaughtered last month, November 2021. And the November 2021 evaluation, so it's actually the current evaluation was used, and the reason that was used is the extract for the November evaluation was done in October, so none of the carcass data from these animals slaughtered last month is included yet in the evaluation. So you're essentially looking at what did the CBV tell us before these animals were slaughtered, and was it a good predictor of how these animals would kill out and what sort of revenue they would generate. So some important questions that you'd like the validation work to clarify for you. So one is, what is the distribution of the CBV? And I know a lot of advisors, when I've been talking to them about this in the past, have sort of asked, you know, what's it at the top end for the suckler animals and where does it go to at the bottom end for your dairy bull calves? How well does it predict future performance? So are the high CBV animals delivering, you know, better performance, and are they generating more revenue when slaughtered? And does it work, you know, equally as well across all the animal types? So is there a chance that it might predict performance better for suckler animals over dairy beef animals, or vice versa? So these are, you know, some of the questions that you'd like answered. So the first one is looking at the distribution. So this is the distribution of the 40,000 steers. So the dairy animals are your blue lines. So you've along the bottom here, then you have the CBV value. So you have less than below minus 80 euros, minus 50 to minus 80, minus 20 to minus 50, and so on, up to the very top end at greater than 250. So the blue lines represent the dairy animals, the orange lines represent dairy beef, and the gray represent your suckler beef. And the distribution is as you would expect. You know, the vast majority of the dairy animals are down here at the very bottom, with two big spikes here in the blue lines. The dairy beef animals are slightly higher then, up, you know, minus 10 to minus 20, 10 to 40. And as you would expect then as well, you know, the vast majority of the suckler animals are up here at the top end, which, you know, your real extreme terminal type animals with very high carcass merits will be, you know, up over plus 250 euros. So our higher CBV animals generating higher value carcasses. So this is an example of analysis that was confined to suckler animals. So we have a breakdown here from 5 stars down to 1 star. You have the counts of the animals, their CBV, their carcass weight figure. So this is not their carcass kilo. This is their carcass weight figure in their index essentially. And then we look at their performance. So we can see here the 5-star animals are coming out at just under 440 kilos. The 1-star animals were back at 368. So already there we're seeing a dramatic difference in carcass weight. My headings, sorry, are a little bit out of kilter here, but this is in spec and confirmation. So as you'd expect with suckler animals, the vast majority of them are going to be killing out above they're going to be an R minus or better. So that's what you'd expect. You know, most of them coming in spec and fat. And the high CBV animals are commanding higher prices per kilo as well. And that's due to the QPS system, or they're being paid on the grade. So they're grading higher, so they're getting a higher price per kilo. And there's quite a significant difference here then as well of about 350 euros here from the 5-star animals back to the 1-star animals on the CBV. Looking at dairy beef animals, and it's, you know, pretty much the same story. You know, significant difference here again. You're talking about 40 to 45 kilos difference there on carcass weight. The inspec drops off a little bit. So the inspec and confirmation, you've just a slight few more maybe falling outside of that R down into O's and P's. The inspec and fat is pretty good. and the average price is a little bit lower as well. But importantly, the 5-star animals are the ones coming with the higher price per kilo, as you'd expect, because they're grading that little bit higher. And again, over €200 there in difference from the 5-star animals to the 1-stars on the final value of the carcass. And interesting as well, and I didn't point it out in the last slide, but this figure down here, this is the number of animals that actually had no sire. And that's a critical part of the CBV, just like an EBI or the Eurostar index. If a sire is missing on an animal, we can't give it a commercial beef value because we only have the dam, and that's only making up 50% of the genetic merit. And there are quite a number of animals going through the system every year, particularly dairy beef and your dairy bull calves where the sire isn't recorded. And I mean, as you can see here, the average performance of those animals with no sire is somewhere in the middle here, in or around the average. So if all of those sires are recorded, there's probably a significant cohort of those animals would be falling into the 5-star bracket, but with no sire recorded, the farmer buying those maybe in the market, even if their mark board is showing the figures, they won't be displayed for these animals. So, there's a missed opportunity there with a lot of them. And this is the last piece of analysis. So this is your dairy cross dairy animals. So these are your Frisian bull calves or your Frisian cross Jersey bull calves. And again, similar story. This looks at the CBV. Now, interestingly, the highest genetic merit animals on the dairy cross dairy side are still coming up with a negative commercial beef value. But, even though it's a minus figure, you're looking for it to be as low a minus figure as possible, if you understand what I'm saying, as close to zero. Now, some of the better ones will be positive, but the vast majority of them will be negative. But as you can see, the 1-star animals then are way down at minus 85 odd euros. Big differences here again in carcass weights. You're looking at 26 kilos. And look, this is a problem that has been well documented in the industry, particularly with these dairy cross dairy animals. An awful lot of them falling out of spec on conformation. Fat is okay. And as you expect, they're lower than the suckler animals and the dairy beef animals on price, because the grades are going to be that bit lower again. But look, about 120 odd euros difference from the 5-star to the 1-star animals there on the final revenue generated from the carcass. So again, look, it's stacking up across all the animal types, your suckler, your dairy beef, and your dairy cross dairy animals. It's very much all stacking up and going in the right direction as we would have hoped. So just in terms of the rollout and how we would educate farmers in this. So look, Teagasc have a big part to play in this, and look, Teagasc would have very much instigated this conversation on the dry stock specialists and advisory side. We were having conversations about this CBV right throughout 2021. Acknowledging the need to give farmers, particularly on the dairy beef side, those farmers buying those calves, extra information when buying them. So look, Teagasc is going to have a big part to play in rolling this out in terms of educating farmers in their literature, their newsletters, any farm walks, hopefully in 2022. And if we can finally get the better of COVID and we can go back to having more frequent farm walks, I'm sure there'll be a lot of demonstrations of the CBV and its merits at these farm walks. The mark boards are going to be a big one, and that's the next big step really for the CBV in early 2022 is getting this rolled out onto the mark boards, particularly ahead of the calf sales next spring, because they're really the critical cohort of animals. I suppose farmers that are buying suckler animals are generally buying them at an older age. Weanlings are being sold at 8-9 months, stores at maybe 15, 16, 17, 18 months. And at that age, it's easier for farmers to differentiate between the best and the worst, because animals will they'll have started to exhibit their genetic potential. But calves really at 2-3 weeks old, it's almost impossible to see the differences between the best and the worst. And I'm sure the farming media will be only too happy to pick up on this as well and write extensively about it. And that'll obviously be important in educating farmers as well. So just to summarize, look, the CBV, it has the potential to be very important for dry stock farmers going forward, not just on the dairy beef side, but it's a big positive as well for those farmers that are buying suckler bred animals, buying your suckler weanlings or buying your stores. I mean, look, as I said, it's easier with the suckler animals to differentiate between the best and the worst by eye because they're being sold at an older age. But I mean, you could still have two very similar animals go through the mart ring one after the other. Similar age, similar breed makeup, similar color even. I know that anecdotally you would hear that color has a big impact, particularly on weanling prices. But those animals that look phenotypically very similar, genetically could be quite different, and there could be a big difference in the revenue generated by those two animals and the potential profit for the farmer when those animals are slaughtered. Look, the high CBV animals, they are exhibiting higher performance, as I showed in the three tables, across all the systems, and they're giving those higher value carcasses. It's equally effective across all the breed types. So your suckler, your dairy beef, and the dairy cross dairy animals, those high 5-star animals are performing the best and leaving the higher value carcass at the end. It definitely increases the onus on dairy farmers as well to use better quality beef sires. And look, better quality is, higher carcass merit beef sires. There has been maybe too much of a focus in the past on with dairy farmers on using, easy calving short gestation sires. But unfortunately, the correlation between easy calving and gestation and carcass merit is not great, i.e., as you push calving ease and short gestation, you're generally pulling down your carcass traits as well, so carcass weight and carcass conformation. So there is an onus on dairy farmers now, because this CBV will be available. Those really poor quality dairy beef calves will be highlighted a lot more going forward if the figures are available in marts. And look, accurate parentage recording is going to be critical. And I pointed it out in one of the tables earlier, the number of animals missing a sire. And it is going to be important, and again, puts the onus very much on dairy farmers as well around the recording of sires, particularly on calves that they maybe don't see as important to their system. So most dairy farmers are recording the sires on their replacement females, but when it comes to maybe bull calves or the dairy beef calves, the Angus's or the Herefords or whatever the case may be, there isn't as much emphasis put on or importance put on recording those sires. But it's critical for the farmers buying them to know what the genetic makeup of them because the day of buying calves because they're Angus or because they're Hereford or because they're of a certain breed, like there's huge differences between breeds, as I showed with the dairy example and the differences in the Frisian bull calves. So just recording the sire breed and not the identity of the sire, isn't really good enough anymore. And look, the rollout to marts in 2022, that's the next big step for this. And, we are going to be working over the next weeks and months to put that in place. The infrastructure is already there because of the replacement index and EBIs being shown for beef and dairy animals respectively. So it's just some of the background IT work needs to be done now to roll this out to marts. And look, obviously there's going to be some education work attached to that as well, because it's going to be a new figure that will be appearing in the mart boards, and farmers need to know what it is, and we don't want there to be any confusion. So look, that's the end of my slides. I hope you found it interesting. I'm more than happy to take any questions. So I'll hand it back to Aidan there, if that's okay.
Thanks very much, Chris, for that. Look, it's a welcome development. Obviously, there's a number of areas that we have to be conscious of in terms of it's been brought up. And one of the questions that has come in there, Chris, can it be made mandatory to record the actual sires? Because that's a huge component, obviously, of the CBV. I mean, either can we incentivize it, or is it possible for the department to make it mandatory to actually record a sire when they're registering the calf?
Yeah, I suppose calf registration is something really that falls under the auspices of the department and any legislation that is put in place. So like currently farmers are legally required to record the date of birth, the dam. So they have to record the actual tag number of the dam. But with sire, they're only obliged to record the sire breed at the moment. They're not obliged to record the actual identity of the dam. Now, farmers participating in BDGP, for example, have to provide the actual identity of the sire. But apart from any schemes, it's not obligatory. Whether it can be made compulsory or not, it's really a question for the department. I suppose the problem with sires is, like, when a cow calves, the mother is beside the calf, and it's much easier to get a dam right when registering. But there could be, in some instances, a lot more questions around the identity of a sire. So there's the potential for more mistakes to be made. ICBF is involved with the department in a DNA pilot project at the moment, where calves are being registered by DNA, and that's growing in terms of the number of herds that are participating every year. And like, if in the long term, if something like that was rolled out nationally, then we would have complete sire recording. But I think we're a few years away from that just yet.
Well, I suppose farmers are really, are in the habit of sampling calves at birth for the BVD. That hopefully, as it nears conclusion, there may be a gap there where we could look at DNA. But just on another point, Chris, just in very simple terms, if I go into the mart and an animal comes in and it has a CBV value of 0, and another animal comes in after it and it has a CBV value of 100, what to a commercial farmer does that mean?
Yeah, so it's an excellent question. So it's 1:1. So in the example you gave, there's €100 difference between the animals. So from the point of view of the 5 traits that are included in the CBV, the difference genetically in those 2 animals, there should be €100 difference in the revenue generated from that animal. Now, it's not all in the end price of the carcass, because you do have feed intake and docility in there as well.
Yeah.
Farmers do see the carcass traits, and it's something that are much more tangible to them, because they see it on the kill sheet, or if they sell an animal through the mart, they see the price per kilo. But we do have to remember that feed intake, and what we're finding in Tully, is there's big differences in the levels of intake between animals, even within the same breed. And when you think of the rising costs of inputs at the moment, feed intake is going to be a very important trait going forward to cut down on costs, but also docility from a health and safety point of view. But look, any of us that are involved with livestock know that quieter cattle, it require an awful lot less labor than animals that are wild or difficult, to get out of the field for testing or dosing or whatever the case may be. So there'd be a labor saving as well with docile animals. So it's €100 in the example you gave, but the majority of it, yes, will be in extra carcass revenue, but some will be in reduced inputs in feed intake and reduced labor as well.
Well, based on the results that you put up there between the 1-star and the 5-star, it actually dovetails nicely in with the points that Frank was making in terms of, 5-star animals, better carcass gain, probably better feed efficiency in a lot of cases, lower emissions longer term. So there's a sustainability component with regard to CBV as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And the other thing that is being found with research from Tully is that, and I suppose it stands to reason, animals that eat less produce less methane, because there's less food being digested in the room, and therefore there's less methane being produced. So by extension, if we're breeding more feed efficient and animals that are eating less feed and getting to a finished weight earlier, then they're producing less methane every day, because they're consuming less feed, but their lifetime total, because they're being slaughtered at a younger age, is lower as well.
Yeah.
So it does dovetail in very nicely with that whole climate thing. Yeah.
Okay. Listen, Chris. I'll come back to you in a second. I know we're running very tight on time, but Frank, just going back to your presentation there was a few points made in terms of some of the questions that came in relation to one of the points that was asked is, what is Teagasc's position, or how do we view the development of anaerobic digesters in terms of a way of controlling emissions?
Look, I wouldn't see anaerobic digesters, the reason for them being just to control emissions from agriculture. Obviously, they're a way to produce renewable energy, and they, in many countries in Europe, they're an important part of the whole renewable energy generation system. Here in Ireland, the incentives really haven't stimulated the development of anaerobic digestion here in Ireland. We understand that's to improve in the coming years. And if it is a runner for farmers, and there's a lot of people anxious that it would be, Well, look, we'll support them. We're actually building a pilot scale anaerobic digester, so a moderate sized digester at our research centre in Grange, and we'll be starting to operate that in the next couple of months. And look, if it is an additional income stream for farmers, well, that'll be great. But I think the big question will be is what are farmers going to get paid, or the digester operators going to get paid for the gas or the electricity that they produce from the digester?
Another point that came up there is, the figures that were quoted in terms of emissions were for 2018. Have we any handle on where the emission levels have gone to, say, in 2020?
Yeah, we have there about the figures in 2018, about 23 million tons. They're about 500,000 lower in 2020. It's a bit complicated that there's kind of a revision of the baseline, in the same way as we every so often revise breeding indices. There's a revision of the baseline here. So, but the main point, I suppose, is the relative figure. So about 500,000 tons of CO2 lower in 2020 than 2018. I would guess, just based on the livestock inventory for 2021 and the fact that nitrogen fertilizer use seems to be gone up. At least the preliminary reporting on nitrogen is that it's gone up, that emissions in 2021 will be a little bit higher than 2020. So probably back up close enough to the 2018 figure.
Okay. And you didn't mention it in your talk, but I mean, with regard to sequestration carbon credits, in terms of the role that farmers might have to play there, I mean, it's not straightforward, obviously, in terms of being able to calculate them, being able to sustain that that's actually what they're doing. But it is something that'll come down the track, I take it.
Absolutely, and I suppose just a couple of quick points about that. Sequestration is important. It's included in another one of those sectors that I showed at the start called LULUCF, LULUCF, which stands for land use change, and forestry. And I suppose the fact that it's in a separate sector means that even though it's important and will be counted in due course, it's not going to contribute to the emissions reduction target that we need. That's a separate target, and we have to reduce those emissions. I think the sequestration, absolutely, the country is going to need a lot of sequestration, both in our forests and in our soils, in both the medium term and the long term. So I would think that there'll be a lot of encouragement and that to farmers to improve sequestration. We're involved in a lot of research at the moment now to give better estimates of what sequestration is going on, both on soils, in hedgerows, and in forests. And I suppose, look, the last point to make in that is that not all soil sequesters carbon. Our kind of good dry mineral soils, yes, we're fairly confident they're sequestering carbon, but our drained peat soils are actually emitting a lot of carbon. And in the same way that the Bordamona bogs, or the bogs being harvested for peat, are emitting carbon, so too does any bog when you drain it. So look, that's something is going to have to be looked at as well, I guess, over the coming years. How can we reduce the emissions from those drained peaty soils?
Okay, just a comment there as well. There's a question has come in looking at some of the research that's underway with regard to carbon efficient breeds. And any comments with regard to that? I know there's work ongoing in Tully. I know that in previous years, Mark McGee had looked at feed efficiency with regard to cattle and Grange, and came up with quite interesting differences even within the one breed.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I suppose, and Chris kind of put this fairly well in one of his comments there. If animals are achieving the same weight gain by eating less feed to do it, they're far more likely then to be producing less methane, because the amount of methane they belch out is very much related to their feed. So look, there are differences between breeds, maybe in terms of their feed efficiency. But I suppose also what we are seeing in some of the latest research is that there's very much differences within breed, just the same as there is for any trait like live weight gain. You'll have differences between breeds, but you'll have differences within breeds. So I suppose in terms of the kind of breeding route to reduce emissions, we're going to be trying to exploit all ways of getting animals that can give us the weight gain that we want, but do that in a way that's associated with less emissions. And look, I think breeding is going to be a very important strategy to tackle this problem over the coming years. And we are working very, very closely with ICBF in relation to that.
Yeah, like I know on the suckler side in particular, one of the key areas that we would have to look at and would actually deliver quite well would be the age at first calving. And that, I suppose, look, it's something that we've highlighted for a number of years. We're sitting in around 21, 22% of females at the ideal age at calving. Whether that can be maybe incentivized further in the future, we'll have to, but it's certainly an area that's going to be targeted going forward.
Absolutely. And look, I suppose we could get caught up in kind of maybe small differences in feed efficiency between animals or between breeds. The big thing is actually lifetime efficiency. It's the same as a car. You buy a car and it might be a great car for 6 months, but if it dies on you, after a few months or a year or two, well, it's a bad car for its lifetime value. You want something that stays going a long time and gives good performance over a long time. So it's the same with beef, cattle, or sheep or whatever. It's the overall lifetime performance. So one of the components of that is age at first calving. If out of a 6 or 7 year old suckler cow, well, if you can get an extra calf out of that cow, well, then she's an efficient contributor, and so on with the age at slaughter. If you can get an animal to 700 kilos or whatever at 24 or 5 months instead of 28 or 9 months, well, bingo, you're making great progress there.
Yeah, and I know there's some questions have come in there with regards to the point on age of slaughter. Paul Crossan will deal in much more detail with that on Wednesday night's conference, and it's just not as straightforward as saying, okay, we're going to pull them back from 26 months to 24 months or whatever, and that'll be worth sort of picking up on with Paul on Wednesday evening. Just Chris,
2 points there, maybe, Aidan, just on the question around breeds, and Frank definitely explained it well. I mean, it's not so much carbon efficient breeds, but carbon efficient animals. There's good and bad within every breed, and maybe, I mean, if you take the dairy beef example, a lot of farmers would rest their laurels on certain breeds for maybe beef stock bulls, but maybe we need to move away from the whole breed argument, and we need to find the best animals within every breed and the best commercial animals, the best pedigree animals for breeding those animals. And look, Tully is, as you said, is showing up big differences is within breeds. On the age of first calving one, like the average age at the moment, I think is 30.4 months for heifers. We're not going to get it to 24 in the morning, but if you look at the numbers, there's about between 150 and 200,000 first calvers calve into the suckler herd every year. It fluctuates. I mean, if there was a month on average taken off that, which is still a long ways off 24 months, but even if we got it to 29 months, like that's 150 odd thousand months, which is about 4.5 million days when you multiply it up. And like in total, if you think of the amount of carbon that would take out of the system, that those animals, they're 30 less days producing or not rearing a calf, if you understand what I'm saying, that they're actually justifying that extra carbon. That would make an awful difference. I mean, if we brought it in 10 years time back to 24 months, look at where it would get things, so there can be huge gains made out of small changes at a national level.
Yeah, just I suppose in relation to your own topic there, Chris, the commercial beef value, the overwhelming comments coming in seems to be around accuracy of sire recording, and that DNA would be the sort of fail-safe way of maybe improving that. Just the other thing that would worry me is that, look, we need to try and get buy-in here with dairy farmers, because one of the things that I would have come across over the years is that when you walk into a shed and it's full of 2 or 3 week old dairy cross calves, they all look shiny, they all look healthy. But in 18 months or 24 months time, it's a different story when you've got 30 or 40 kilos difference in carcass weight and the purchase price was all the same. It's going to be hugely important that, apart from getting commercial buyers into the mindset of looking up the value, trying to bring some of the dairy farmers on side, which may not be that easy.
And this is where the dairy beef index comes into play. And that has been there now for the past two years, since I think spring 2020. But not alone just the DBI, but the DBI has 2 main components. You have the calving subindex and the beef subindex. And it is possible for some beef bulls to have a high DBI, but most of it is coming from the fact that they're easy calving and short gestation. And if farmers keep choosing those high DBI bulls based on calving traits, then we're not really going anywhere. But we want farmers, dairy farmers, to, when they're selecting beef bulls, either AI or stock, to look for high DBI bulls, but to also look for not just easy calving and short gestation, but they're looking at the beef component, and they're looking at to bring in bulls with higher carcass traits as well.
Okay. Just one comment, Frank, there that came in relation to the programs that we have, the Future Beef and the Dairy Beef 500. There's a question has come in relation to the fact that this Future Beef concentrates mainly on suckler farms. The dairy beef is obviously self-explanatory, but is there scope within the Teagasc programs to take in a few more trading farms?
Yeah. So look, just before I come to that, Pierce, just one very quick comment on the CVB. And look, I think it's a great development. Anything that can, I suppose, help farmers in terms of buying stock, or also maybe give a reward to farmers that are breeding the better stock is to be welcomed. And look, I'm sure it'll be refined over the years, and the sire accuracy will be improved, and whether that's through DNA or whatever. But look, the only point I want to make is, the genetics is really important, but also, the difference between a calf, we'll say that got colostrum versus one that didn't, is also hugely important. So when you're going in looking at a pen of calves, are some of them a bit scoury looking versus do they all look very healthy? Like that difference could be way more than the 20 or 30 difference in CBV. So knowing the calves, buying healthy calves is still going to be a very, very important message, I suppose, when you're trying to source stock. In relation to the Future Beef program, look, I don't have the exact details, but some of those farms that we're involved with in the Future Beef are also involved in different elements. So they're buying in cattle and finishing them on and so on. They're not all kind of straightforward suckler to finish or suckler to weaning. There is an element of trading going on some of the farms. And look, if we feel that we need more farms in relation to that type of activity, we can certainly look at that. It's not fixed in stone, but as far as I know, there is a reasonably good element of trading going on that existing cohort of farms.
Yeah, I'm glad you made the point there with regard to the animal health, because on the Green Acres program, that was a very, very strong component of the lads that done well. It was that the calves coming in healthy, bought from a good source, was absolutely critical to future profitability of the overall system. Listen, look, it's 13 minutes past 9. I've overshot the runway here with regard to time. Can I thank Chris for presenting, and as well yourself, Director, for giving us a good insight in terms of some of the things that we're going to be faced with regard. And I mean, this is going to be very much down to individual farm decisions in terms of some people may go down a less intensive route. Other farms may look to stay intensive and work within the system, which again, with good science, will be doable. And that, so look, there's a lot of challenges ahead, a lot of work for both researchers, advisories, and farmers ahead in the years to come if we're to meet this target in 2030. So thank you both for your contributions this evening. Just before I finish up, I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in. Hopefully you got value out of it. And just to remind you that the second part of the virtual beef conference is on Wednesday evening, the 8th of December at 8 p.m. You can register to log into that. And on Wednesday evening's presentation or conference, that's going to be hosted by Matt O'Keefe. And we'll have Dr. Paul Crossan, who's head of centre in Grange, going to go through the merits of finishing cattle at a younger age and how that can contribute to sort of carbon footprint and the sort of and as I said, it's not all straightforward. And we'll also have a panel discussion after that, again with the director, Professor Frank O'Mara, and with Dr. Kevin Hanrahan, who's head of rural economy within Teagasc. And really, they're going to be looking and debating some of the issues around climate change, but also the immediate challenges that farmers are going to face, particularly in 2022, with increased input costs and what way the markets might pan out with regard to what's ahead of us in the next year in particular. So listen, thank you all for tuning in. Obviously, keep safe with COVID and keep safe with Storm Barra on its way tomorrow. And with that, we'll leave you, and thanks very much.